Before you take this journey, you should know. Some bonds are not forged in the heat of a gunfight, but in the quiet warmth of a shared hearth. This is not a story of a hero and a damsel, but of a protector and a survivor who discovered that the most profound act of courage is to let oneself be cared for, and that the most intimate vow is the one spoken without a single word. The silence in Elias Thorne's house was a well-kept thing, as orderly as the tools that hung on his workshop wall. Each hammer, each pair of tongs, had its place, cleaned and oiled after the day's fire and toil. He lived his life in the same manner. He rose before the sun, fired the forge, worked until noon, ate a solitary meal of bread and jerky, and worked again until the light failed. Then he would come inside, wash the soot from his hands and forearms, and sit at the small table he had built himself. The chair opposite his was always empty. The bed in the corner was made for one. It was a life of clean lines and quiet sufficiency, and it was deeply, achingly lonely. He had come to this small frontier town of promise to escape the noise of his past, the clang of sabers, the crack of rifles, the shouts of men. Here, the only sound was the ring of his hammer on steel, a rhythm he controlled. He was a man who spoke little, but listened closely, and he had learned that in a place like Promise, a man's reputation was built on the sturdiness of his work and the stillness of his tone. He mended what was broken: wagon wheels, cook stoves, plowshares. He could not, however, mend the hollow space in his own home. Clara Mae's arrival in Promise was a quiet disruption, a stone tossed into the still pond of the town's daily life. She came on the afternoon stage, a single worn valise her only companion. She was a widow. They whispered, though no one knew her story. What they saw was a woman with resilience in her posture and a deep, guarded weariness in her eyes. She sought work, taking in mending, her stitches fine and even, but it was not enough to afford a room of her own. She slept on a cot in the back of the mercantile, a temporary arrangement that was quickly becoming untenable. The proprietor, Mr. Sterling, was a man whose generosity always came with a price tag, and his gaze lingered on Clara with a proprietary air that made her skin crawl. He was a predator who cloaked his intentions in the guise of charity, and Clara was a survivor who recognized the look all too well. She had fled a life of it and would not be caged again. Her options were dwindling. The arrangement was brokered by Ison, an Apache woman who lived on the edge of town and moved through it with a quiet, knowing grace. She sold herbs and remedies, but her true trade was in seeing the hidden truths of people's hearts. She saw the coiled honor in the silent blacksmith and the fierce desire for dignified safety in the new seamstress. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, she found Elias banking the fire in his forge. She did not waste words. "The woman, Clara Mae. She needs a safe harbor. You have a spare room." Elias's instinct was to refuse. His solitude was his shield. "I'm not looking for a boarder." Ison's dark eyes held his. "This is not about coin. Mr. Sterling watches her like a hawk watches a rabbit. She needs protection, not a landlord, a wall of honest respect around her." She paused, her gaze sweeping over his empty house, the single chair, the lonely lamplight flickering in the window. "And you need a home, not just a roof." He remained silent, his jaw tight. Ison took a step closer, her voice softening, becoming something other than a proposal. It was a piece of wisdom, offered gently. "She is proud. She will not accept charity, but she will accept work. You need a housekeeper, a fair trade." She looked from his calloused, capable hands to the quiet house waiting for him. "She needs a safe place to land. Take her hand, she's been waiting for you." He did not understand the words then, not fully. He thought she meant a woman waiting for rescue. He would learn, in time, that Clara Mae was not waiting for a hero. She was waiting for a man who would see the lock on her door and choose not to turn the key. Clara's first day in Elias's house was a study in quiet negotiation. She arrived with her valise, her back straight, her chin held high. She did not act like a woman seeking refuge, but like an employee reporting for duty. She surveyed the small, Spartan living space clean, but lacking any touch of comfort. It was the house of a man who did not live in his rooms, but merely passed through them. "The arrangement," she began, her voice clear and steady, "is for room and board in exchange for housekeeping, cooking, and mending. Is that your understanding?" Elias, standing by the cold hearth, simply nodded. He felt awkward, oversized in his own home. Her presence filled the silence in a way that was both unsettling and strangely welcome. "The room is there," he said, gesturing to a small door off the main space. "The lock is new." He had spent the morning fitting it, making sure it was sturdy. It was his first unspoken promise. "You are safe here." She gave him a small, grateful nod, the first crack in her formal demeanor, and disappeared inside. He heard the quiet, definite click of the latch. Their life fell into a rhythm, dictated by the rising sun and the needs of the forge. Clara was a silent, efficient presence. She rose early, and the scent of coffee and frying bacon would greet him when he came in from his morning work, a stark and welcome change from his usual dry bread. She cleaned the house with a thoroughness that polished the dull wood of the floorboards and let new light into the grimy windows. She took his work-worn shirts, their seams threatening to give way, and mended them with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. He watched her sometimes when she didn't know he was looking. He watched her hands, deft and sure as they kneaded dough or guided a needle. They were hands that knew work, but they were also gentle. He found himself leaving the best cuts of meat for her, ensuring the water bucket was always full, placing a new, brighter lantern on the table beside her mending basket. These were the only words he knew how to say. "I see you. I value your work. I am glad you are here." Clara, in turn, watched Elias. She saw the way he moved, with a powerful economy of motion that spoke of immense strength held in careful reserve. He never entered her space without a soft knock on the doorframe. When he passed her a plate, his fingers were careful not to brush against hers. He was a man who understood boundaries, not as walls to keep people out, a concept she knew all too well, but as lines of respect to be honored. One evening, she found a small, expertly carved wooden bird sitting on her windowsill. It was simple, unfinished, but the lines were graceful, the head tilted in a curious, lively expression. There was no note. None was needed. It was a piece of him, of his quiet skill, offered without expectation. She placed it on the small table by her bed, a symbol of the strange, safe world she was beginning to build within the walls of the blacksmith's house. The silence between them began to change. It was no longer empty, but filled with a growing awareness of each other, a quiet hum of shared space and unspoken consideration. He had a recurring nightmare. It was always the same. The smell of gun smoke, the chaos of a battlefield he had tried so hard to forget, the weight of a fallen comrade. He would wake with a start, his heart hammering against his ribs, the silence of his room a stark contrast to the phantom noise in his head. He would lie there, breathing slowly, until the ghosts retreated, leaving him with the familiar ache of solitude. But one night, the dream was worse than usual. He woke with a choked gasp, sitting bolt upright, his hands clenched into fists. A thin sheen of cold sweat covered his skin. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, resting his head in his hands, trying to force the images from his mind. A floorboard creaked in the main room. He looked up, his senses instantly on high alert. Clara stood in the doorway of her room, a silhouette against the faint moonlight filtering through the window. She held a patchwork quilt clutched to her chest. "Mr. Thorne?" she whispered, her voice laced with concern. "Are you all right?" He was ashamed. He did not want her to see this part of him, the broken soldier beneath the stoic blacksmith. "A bad dream," he managed, his voice rough. "Go back to bed. I'm fine." She hesitated, then took a step into the room. "You are not fine," she said softly, not as an accusation, but as a simple statement of fact. "You cried out." He didn't know what to say. The silence stretched between them, thick with things unsaid. She walked to the hearth, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor, and lit a small lamp. The warm, flickering light pushed back the shadows, and with them, some of the dream's lingering chill. She didn't press him for details. She simply brought the light. She poured a cup of water from the bucket and held it out to him. Her hand was steady. He took it, their fingers brushing for the first time. The touch was electric, a jolt of warmth that had nothing to do with the lamp. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling inadequate. She gave a small nod, her eyes full of a deep, quiet understanding that went beyond anything he could have explained. "Sometimes the night is too loud," she said. It was a confession, an offering of her own past sorrows to meet his. She did not pry. She simply stood with him in the shared space of their respective pains. He drank the water, the coolness soothing his raw throat. When he looked up again, she was gone, the quilt left neatly folded on the chair opposite his bed. He reached out and touched the soft, worn fabric. It was the kindest thing anyone had done for him in a very long time. He did not go back to his own bed. He pulled the quilt around his shoulders, sat in the chair, and watched the lamp burn until morning, the memory of her quiet compassion a better shield against the darkness than any wall he had ever built. The summer heat settled over Pronis like a heavy blanket, making the air in the forge a shimmering, suffocating thing. Elias worked shirtless, his skin slick with sweat, the muscles in his back and shoulders coiling and releasing with each swing of the hammer. He was shaping a new set of hinges for the church doors, intricate work that required focus and precision. He was so absorbed in the task, in the rhythm of fire and steel, that he didn't hear Clara approach until she was standing just inside the wide doorway, holding a tin cup. "I brought you some water," she said, her voice a cool note in the oppressive heat. He stopped, the hammer resting on the anvil, and turned. He was suddenly, intensely aware of his own bareness, of the grime and soot that covered him. He watched her walk toward him, her eyes not on his chest, but on his hands, which he quickly wiped on his leather apron. She held the cup out to him. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough. He drank deeply, the cool water a balm. When he handed the cup back, he saw a smudge of soot on her cheek. Without thinking, his instinct to fix what was broken, to clean what was soiled, took over. He raised his hand, his thumb moving to gently brush the smudge away. He stopped an inch from her skin. The air crackled between them. He had not asked. His gaze dropped from her cheek to her eyes, a silent question. "May I?" Clara's breath hitched. No one had ever asked for her permission for such a small thing. Her previous life had been filled with hands that took without asking. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. Yes, his touch was incredibly gentle. The calloused pad of his thumb brushed her cheek, a feather-light stroke that sent a shiver through her entire body. The moment stretched, timeless. It was more intimate than any kiss she had ever known. He pulled his hand back as if he'd been burned, a flush rising on his neck. "Sorry," he mumbled, turning back to the forge, his composure shattered. From that moment, something shifted between them. The careful boundaries they had erected began to feel less like walls and more like the banks of a river, defining a current that was growing steadily stronger. They began to talk more, their conversations starting with practical things, the price of flour, a loose floorboard, but slowly meandering into more personal territory. He learned she was from the East, that she loved the color of the sky just before a summer rain, that she had a wry, quiet sense of humor that she only revealed in small, unguarded moments. She learned that he had a younger sister he wrote to every month, that he had a surprising knowledge of wildflowers, and that the deep sadness in his eyes was a grief he carried for the men he had lost in the war. One evening, after a particularly long day, he came into the house to find her sitting at the table, her mending basket beside her, a book open in her lap. She was tracing the words with her finger, her brow furrowed in concentration. "I can teach you to read it properly," he offered, his voice quiet. Her head snapped up, a look of fierce, vulnerable pride in her eyes. "I can read. I know," he said gently. "But the letters can be a struggle. I could help." She hesitated, the offer hanging in the air. To accept would be to admit a vulnerability, a need. But his tone was one of simple, honest assistance, with no hint of condescension. It was an offering, not a judgment. "All right," she said, her voice barely a whisper. So began their nightly ritual. He would sit beside her, his large frame carefully angled so as not to crowd her, and guide her through the difficult words. His finger would point to a line, his voice a low, patient rumble as he sounded out the syllables. The lamplight enclosed them in a small, intimate circle of warmth, the rest of the world fading away. It was in these quiet lessons that they learned the shape of each other's hands, the sound of each other's breathing, the simple, profound comfort of closeness. The first autumn rain came without warning, a sudden, violent downpour that turned the dusty streets of Promise into a sea of mud. The wind howled, rattling the window panes and finding every crack in the old house. Elias was securing the shutters on the workshop when he heard a small cry of frustration from inside. He hurried in to find Clara standing in her room, staring up at the ceiling. A steady drip of dark water was falling from a crack in the roof, landing squarely in the middle of her narrow bed. The mattress was already soaked. Her meager belongings, stored in a small wooden trunk at the foot of the bed, were in danger of being ruined. He immediately went to work, moving her trunk to the driest corner of the main room, his movements efficient and sure. He placed a bucket under the leak, the rhythmic plink of the water a dismal counterpoint to the raging storm outside. When everything was secured, they stood in the middle of the room, the problem of the night hanging between them. Her bed was unusable. The floor was drafty and cold. There was only one other bed in the house, his. The thought was a lightning strike, immediate and potent. He cleared his throat, a sound loud in the storm-filled silence. "You can? You can take my bed," he said, the words feeling clumsy. "I'll sleep by the hearth. The floor is fine for me." Clara looked from her ruined bed to his, a large, sturdy frame with a thick mattress and a pile of warm-looking blankets. She thought of sleeping on the hard floor, of the cold seeping into her bones. Then she looked at him, at his offer to take the less comfortable spot, at the quiet respect that was always present in his actions. She had a choice. She could accept his offer as it was, maintaining the distance between them. Or she could choose to trust him completely. "That's a foolish notion," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "For you to be on the cold floor in your own house. It's a big bed." The implication hung in the air, fragile and immense. She was offering a new arrangement, one built not on practicality, but on a nascent, trembling trust. Elias's heart hammered in his chest. He looked at her, at the quiet courage in her eyes, and knew this was a pivotal moment. He had to be sure. He had to give her every chance to retreat. "Clara," he said, speaking her first name for the first time, the sound of it unfamiliar and intimate on his tongue. "Are you certain?" She met his gaze without flinching. "I am." She took the spare quilt from the chair and rolled it into a long, tight bundle. "We can put this between us." A line drawn. A boundary stated and respected. A bridge, not a wall. Later, when the storm had settled into a steady, drumming rhythm on the roof, they lay in the dark, separated by the quilt, intensely aware of each other's presence. He could hear the soft sound of her breathing. He could feel the faint warmth radiating from her side of the bed. It was a chaste, proper arrangement, and yet it was the most profoundly intimate experience of his life. He lay awake for hours, not from nightmares, but from the quiet, overwhelming realization that he was no longer alone in the dark. The town of Promise had watched the arrangement between the blacksmith and the seamstress with a curious, speculative eye. Most, seeing the quiet respect with which Elias treated Clara, were content to mind their own business. But Mr. Sterling was not most people. He saw Clara's presence in Elias's house as a personal affront, a rejection of his own perceived largesse, and a challenge to his standing. He began a quiet campaign of whispers, his insinuations as venomous as they were subtle. He spoke of Clara's unknown past, of the impropriety of her living situation, of the blacksmith's reclusive nature. He sought to isolate them, to turn public opinion against them, to make Clara's position so untenable she would have no choice but to turn to him. The pressure mounted. Ladies who had once given Clara mending work now crossed the street to avoid her. The cheerful greetings Elias had grown accustomed to from his customers were replaced by curt nods and suspicious glances. They were being cordoned off, an island in the midst of the small community. Clara bore the slights with a quiet dignity that broke Elias's heart. He saw the hurt in her eyes, though she never spoke of it. The whispers escalated when Sterling, emboldened by the town's cooling demeanor, confronted them outside the mercantile. He stood before them, blocking their path, his face a mask of false concern. "Mrs. Mae," he said, his voice loud enough for the onlookers to hear, "I am worried for you, a woman of your delicate position, living with a man like that." He gestured dismissively toward Elias. "It is not proper. I still have that room for you. A safe, respectable place." The implication was clear. He was offering her a cage disguised as a sanctuary. Clara's hand, which was resting lightly on Elias's arm, tightened. It was an involuntary gesture, a seeking of strength. Elias felt the small pressure and stood taller, a silent, immovable wall at her side. He did not look at Sterling. He looked at Clara. "Clara?" he said, his voice low and calm, for her ears only. "What do you want to do?" He was giving her the power, deferring to her agency in front of everyone. It was a profound act of trust and partnership. Clara took a deep breath. She turned her gaze from Elias to Sterling, and the weary guardedness was gone, replaced by a cool, unshakable resolve. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that cut through the street noise, "my position is not delicate. It is secure. I have a home, and I am not in need of another. Thank you for your concern." She then looked pointedly at his hand, which was resting on a barrel of flour. "You have a smudge on your cuff." With that, she turned and walked away, her head held high. Elias fell into step beside her, their shoulders almost touching. They did not speak as they walked back to the smithy. They didn't have to. In that public square, in the face of judgment and insinuation, they had made their choice. They had chosen each other. The silent blacksmith and the quiet seamstress had become a united front. That night, the house felt different. The confrontation with Sterling had stripped away the last vestiges of their formal arrangement. They were no longer just a blacksmith and his housekeeper. They were partners, allies who had weathered a public storm together. After their simple supper, Clara brought out her mending basket, but she did not start sewing. Elias sat across from her, cleaning the mechanism of a rifle with a quiet, focused intensity. The silence was comfortable, charged with unspoken emotion. "He will not stop," Clara said softly, breaking the quiet. "Men like him believe that what they want, they are owed." Elias looked up from his work, his hands stilling. "He will not set foot in this house again," he said. It was not a boast. It was a vow. He picked up the rifle, checked the action one last time, and then did something that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. He held the rifle out to her, but first, the barrel pointed safely at the floor. It was the gesture of a soldier, an act of ultimate trust offering a weapon to another in the safest possible way. It said, "I trust you. I will not harm you. My strength is yours to command." She reached out and rested her hand on the polished wood of the stock for a moment before letting it fall. "I know," she whispered. He put the rifle away and returned to the table. "Clara," he began, his voice hesitant. "My past, the reason I came here. It was the war. I saw. I did things. Necessary things, but they left a mark." He looked down at his hands, as if seeing the stains of old battles there. "I wanted a place where my hands could be used to build, not to break." It was the most he had ever spoken of himself, a confession offered into the warm lamplight. Clara listened, her heart aching for the pain he carried so silently. When he was done, she offered a piece of her own broken past. "My husband," she started, her voice trembling slightly. "He was not a kind man. He saw me as a possession, something he owned. When he died, I ran. I was not running from grief. I was running toward the hope of a life where I could be my own person, where my door had a lock on the inside." Their stories, though different, were two sides of the same coin. Both had sought refuge from a world of violence and coercion, and had found it in this quiet shared space. Elias reached across the table, and for the first time took her hand. He did not speak. He simply held it, his large, warm hand completely enveloping hers. It was not a gesture of possession, but of profound, tender solidarity. It was a promise. Your past is safe with me. You are not alone. Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but for the first time in a long time, they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of relief. The next day, Sterling made his final move. He arrived at the smithy not with whispers, but with the town marshal and a piece of paper. It was a notice of eviction, crudely written and legally dubious, claiming Clara was a vagrant, and that Elias was harboring her in defiance of town decency ordinances that Sterling himself had lobbied for. It was a transparent attempt to use the law as a weapon of coercion. Elias met them at the door of the house, his stance solid, unmovable. Clara stood just behind him, visible in the doorway, her presence a silent declaration of her right to be there. "Sterling," Elias said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You are not welcome here. Leave." Sterling smirked, gesturing to the marshal. "I'm afraid she's the one who has to leave, Thorne. By order of the town council." The marshal, a decent man caught in a difficult position, looked uncomfortable. "Elias, my hands are tied. The paper is signed." Elias did not move. He did not reach for a weapon. His power did not lie in the threat of violence, but in the unshakable certainty of his conviction. He simply held his ground. "This is her home," he said, the words clear and absolute. At that moment, Clara stepped forward, moving to stand beside Elias, their shoulders touching. She looked not at the marshal, but directly at Sterling, her gaze unflinching. "I am not a vagrant," she said, her voice ringing with the force of her hard-won agency. "I am employed. I have a place. I choose to be here." The simple, powerful declaration shifted the entire dynamic. This was no longer about a man protecting a helpless woman. This was about two people, a partnership, claiming their space. The marshal looked from Sterling's sneer to the quiet, united strength of Elias and Clara. He saw the truth of the situation. He folded the paper and handed it back to Sterling. "This is a civil matter, Sterling, not a legal one. Settle it yourselves. I won't be a party to this." He tipped his hat to Clara and Elias. "Ma'am, Thorne." And with that, he turned and walked away. Sterling was left sputtering, his power evaporating in the face of their solidarity. He was a predator who relied on isolating his prey. Faced with a united front, he was nothing. He threw the paper to the ground in disgust and stormed off, defeated not by a punch or a bullet, but by a quiet, unbreakable bond. Elias and Clara stood in the doorway for a long moment after he was gone, the air settling around them. He looked down at her, a slow, unguarded smile spreading across his face for the first time. "Clara Mae," he said, the sound of her name spoken softly, a victory in itself. She smiled back, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up her whole face. Elias Thorne. In the quiet aftermath of the confrontation, they had found each other's names, and in doing so, had truly found each other. The tension of the confrontation drained away, leaving a strange, quiet intimacy in its wake. The house, which had been a fortress against the outside world, now felt like a true sanctuary. They moved back into the kitchen, the heart of their home. Clara's hands were trembling, a delayed reaction to the adrenaline and fear. She began to tidy the already clean counter, her movements jerky and unfocused. Elias came and stood beside her. He did not speak. He gently took her hands, stilling their nervous motion. He turned them over in his own, his touch infinitely careful. On the ball of her thumb, he saw a small red pinprick, a tiny bead of blood welling up where she had pricked herself while mending his shirt the night before. It was an insignificant wound, but in that moment it seemed to hold all the care and tenderness that had grown between them. He led her to the wash basin, his hand warm and steady around her wrist. He pumped fresh water, the sound of the handle a gentle, rhythmic creak in the quiet room. He washed her hands as if they were the most precious, delicate things he had ever held. He cleaned the tiny wound, his touch sure and soothing. He then took a clean strip of cloth from her mending basket and, with intense concentration, wrapped it carefully around her thumb, tying a neat, secure knot. The whole world narrowed to that single, focused act of care. It was aftercare. It was a mending. It was a prayer. When he was done, he did not release her hand. He held it, turning it over again, and raised it to his lips. He pressed a soft, reverent kiss to the back of her hand, just below the knuckles. It was a gesture of fealty, of devotion. It was a promise sealed. Clara's eyes filled with tears. She had spent a lifetime protecting herself, building walls to keep out the cruelty of the world. And here was a man whose strength was expressed not in force, but in the gentlest of touches, whose protection was not a cage, but an open hand. He met her gaze, his own eyes dark with an emotion so deep it was bottomless. There, in the quiet of the kitchen, with the scent of wood smoke and baking bread in the air, he was asking the most important question of all, without saying a word. She gave him his answer. She leaned forward and rested her forehead against his, a gesture of absolute trust and surrender. They stood like that for a long time, simply breathing each other in, two solitudes that had finally, miraculously, found their home. The lamplight cast their joined shadows on the wall, no longer two separate figures, but one. The days that followed were filled with a soft, peaceful light. The arrangement was gone, replaced by a partnership that was as natural and essential as breathing. They moved around each other in this small house with an easy, practiced grace, their paths crossing and diverging in a comfortable domestic dance. He would bring her a cup of coffee in the morning, just the way she liked it. She would have a hot meal waiting for him when he came in from the forge, his hunger as much for her presence as for the food. One evening, he did not come in at his usual time. Clara found him in the workshop, the fire in the forge burning low. He was not working on a plowshare or a wagon wheel. He was hunched over the anvil, focused on a small, delicate object held in his tongs. He was hammering with a tiny, precise rhythm, shaping and refining the piece of hot metal. She watched him from the doorway, the firelight casting his strong features in shades of orange and red. He was a man at peace, his craft now a source of creation, not just repair. When he was finished, he plunged the object into the quenching bucket. A hiss of steam rose, and then silence. He turned, a small, shy smile on his face, and held it out to her. It was an iron scarf pin. He had forged it into the shape of a wildflower, the kind he had once told her he knew from the hillsides. The petals were thin and delicate, the stem gracefully curved. It was a thing of impossible beauty, wrought from the same hard, unforgiving material he used to make tools and weapons. It was strength and gentleness combined. It was him. Clara took it, her fingers tracing the cool, smooth lines of the metal. It was the most beautiful gift she had ever received. It was a piece of his heart, given freely. It was a symbol, a promise, a vow forged in fire. "Elias," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He reached out and gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, his touch now familiar, welcome. "I'm not a man of words, Clara," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But this house, it was just a roof until you came. You made it a home." He paused, his gaze holding hers. "I would be honored if you would choose to stay. Always." She didn't need to speak. Her answer was in the radiant smile that broke across her face, in the way she reached up and put her arms around his neck, pulling him down for a kiss that was both a beginning and a homecoming. It was a kiss that tasted of soot and tears and the sweet, certain promise of 1,000 shared mornings to come. Their life together settled into a quiet, beautiful rhythm. The town of promise, seeing the genuine, unshakable bond between them, slowly came around. The whispers died, replaced by nods of respect. Mr. Sterling, his power broken, kept his distance. Elias and Clara had built their own world within the walls of the smithy, a world of mutual care and quiet devotion. They were married by the traveling preacher in a simple ceremony under the shade of a large cottonwood tree, with only Ison and the town marshal as their witnesses. Ison, her eyes wise and knowing, simply smiled. "I told you," she said to Elias later, as they shared a small cake Clara had baked. She was waiting for a man who knew how to hold a hand, not just take it. Elias looked across the small gathering to where Clara was laughing, a sound that was still new and precious to him. His iron wildflower was pinned to her shawl. Their love story was written not in grand declarations, but in 1,000 small, repeated gestures. It was in the way he always checked the locks at night, a habit he no longer needed for his own peace of mind, but for hers. It was in the way she stitched his initials, E.T., into the corner of his shirts, a small, proud claim. It was in the lessons that continued by lamplight, her reading growing more confident each night. It was in the second chair at the table, no longer empty. One cool evening, as the first stars began to appear, they sat on the bench outside the workshop, watching the colors of the sky fade. Clara leaned her head on his shoulder, his arm coming around her in a gesture of comfortable, protective love. The silence between them was full, not empty. It was filled with the peace of a hard-won sanctuary, with the certainty of a shared future. "Elias," she said softly. "Yes, Clara Mae?" "I'm home," she whispered. He tightened his embrace, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. He didn't need to say the words back. She could feel it in his touch. She could see it in the steady, devoted light in his eyes. He was home, too. Finally and forever.